Now I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for our panel on climate impact on agriculture, Manvi Bhardwaj. Manvi is lead for global coordination at the India Climate Collaborative, where she supports India's climate actors in engaging with global platforms and fosters collaboration across the global south. She's a systems thinker and a sustainability generalist. She's passionate about regeneration, networks, and climate action, and we are very excited to have her guide this important conversation.
Thank you, Shrenya, and hello, everyone. For those who've just dialed in for this session, welcome. And I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel discussion that throws some light on exciting ways in which farmers are being supported to build resilience to the adverse impacts of climate change. We have with us today on the panel Ashdeep Seth. She's a design and engineering consultant at Kheyti, a strategy consultant at the Engineering for Change and American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and a lecturer at UC Berkeley. Hi, Ashdeep. Arti Dhar, who's the co-founder of Farmers for Forests. Hi, Arti. And Rikin Gandhi, who's the CEO of Digital Green. Hello, Rikin. So before we jump into the work of your organizations, Ashdeep, Arti, and Rikin, it would be wonderful for the audience to get to know you all a little bit. So if you could, Ashdeep, Arti, and Rikin in that order, in under a minute each, give us a quick glimpse into what sparked your passion for sustainable agriculture and community engagement. Ashdeep.
Absolutely. Great to see everyone. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Indiaspora, for having this event. I will keep it quick. I'm going to keep an eye on time. I know we're short on time. I think context a little bit starts with having parents who are architects. So there was always this big looming question of what role does do I as an individual, and does my education have in terms of service to society? I ended up at Stanford to study an engineering and design degree, and that was my first time in the States. Being in Silicon Valley was interesting, but that question stayed with me. And after being an entrepreneur in the medical device space, I was very fortunate to find agriculture. Actually, I found Kheyti at the time and had an opportunity to really dive deep into the space of agriculture and the critical aspect of community engagement that comes with it, to start working on and continue to answer this question of how does technology actually be of service to society, of improving quality of lives and increasing access to basic fundamental resources. But I'll stop there. Arti, all you.
Great. And again, I'm Arti. I am one of the co-founders at Farmers for Forests. It's very nice to be here. The group of people that came together, a very tiny group of people that came together to start Farmers for Forests, we all just happen to be lifelong nature and animal lovers. And I guess more like neophyte environmentalists. I coincidentally studied international development and started my career working on rural women's financial inclusion projects and education. So spent a lot of time living and working in rural communities across India and Sri Lanka. So I had the opportunities to see the impacts of climate change firsthand on these communities starting many, many years ago. And that was essentially the impetus to transition and work full-time on climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Cool. And I could jump in. I'm Rikin Gandhi from Digital Green. Growing up, I was inspired by astronauts, and so I sought to put together my own astronaut playbook by studying computer science, aerospace engineering, getting a pilot license with aspirations of trying to get into space. But before I got all the way there, I kind of reflected on a lot of these astronaut biographies before me, and many astronauts would see the Earth from above and wonder, why is there war? Why is there poverty? And I then moved to India in 2006 in rural Maharashtra and was able to see for the first time how a small minority of farmers saw agriculture as a source of prosperity, while the vast majority of farmers were trying to migrate out of these rural communities and didn't see agriculture as having a future for their children. I then connected with Microsoft Research in Bangalore that had just recently set up a technology for emerging markets group and sought to see, could we use digital technology to empower these rural communities to become their own heroes, as I was inspired by astronauts in their own right, producing, the second highest farm output in the world. India has a lot to be proud of with its agricultural output, but still, obviously, there's so much climate kind of variability and challenge, and these farmers obviously have economic challenges that they deal with in trying to make really this agriculture as a source of prosperity and not a vocation of last resort.
Great. Thank you, Ashdeep, Arti, and Rikin, for sharing your stories. And I think now we can jump right in. So Arti, Farmers for Forests has been supporting farmers to restore degraded lands. It would be great if you could throw some light on the issue of degraded lands in India and their interplay with climate. And how is Farmers for Forests addressing these challenges through the payment for ecosystems model that you've been testing out? And what kind of impact is that creating in terms of climate and other co-benefits?
Yeah, so at Farmers for Forests, our model is rooted in a simple idea, which is that farmers don't just have to be cultivators of crops, but stewards of healthy ecosystems that help mitigate climate change instead of contributing to it. And they should be rewarded for those practices as well. In many parts of India, especially dryland regions where we work a lot, farmers own land that's often degraded or unproductive. So for context, an estimated 30% of India's land is now considered degraded. And these are government estimates. So that's like around 98 million hectares. It's like 3 Germanys put together. We work with farmers and indigenous communities to transition that kind of land into biodiverse agroforests. So planting a mix of native trees, fruit-bearing species, and sometimes other ecological buffers like nitrogen-fixing species, shrubs, grasses, etc. What makes our approach slightly different is the use of payment for ecosystem services that you referred to, or PES, because it's a mouthful. That means we compensate farmers not just for planting trees, but for keeping them alive, which is actually the hardest thing to do. Planting trees is relatively easier. The financial incentive is linked to tree survival, which we monitor using satellite and drone imagery and field verification. So in our case, the smallholder farmers are getting support not only in terms of use of us being a one-stop shop for all the inputs and technical support they could possibly need to transition to agroforestry, but they are generating new livelihoods for themselves, not only in terms of the payments, but also the income they will receive from the harvest in few years as well. In terms of environmental outcomes, we are obviously seeing an increase in carbon sequestration, which is pretty easy to calculate given we are putting new trees in the ground. We're also seeing increase in biodiversity, increase in pollinators like bees and butterflies, improvement in soil quality, soil organic carbon over time as well.
Great, thanks. And thanks for shedding light, I think, on both the practice of agroforestry, but also the people angle here and the benefits that it's creating for farmers, because sustainable agriculture is as much about people as it is about practices. And without community engagement, even the best strategies fall short. So Rikin, related to that, Digital Green has pioneered the approach of video-based farmer education. Can you tell us more about this? And also specifically, how has your peer-to-peer video model evolved with context to climate-related risks, which I'm sure you've seen over a period of time becoming more and more apparent? And what have you learned about, what does effective knowledge transfer look like in rural farming communities?
Yeah, one of like the anecdotes I can share from the field just when we were just starting off Digital Green, working with an NGO outside of Bangalore called the Green Foundation, promoting biodiversity and sustainable agricultural types of practices, there was a community in which widowed women had been physically ostracized to the outskirts of the village community, but she had innovated with a biofertilizer concoction that she was seeing good results for her vegetable plot. We featured her on a video, and we shared that video with her fellow community. And initially, people asked, why are you showing us this video about this person who we don't care to interact with?" But as they kind of progressed in actually watching this video, then they sought to know who she was, to go and visit her and see if this was true, the type of results that she was seeing. And that's really the power that we found with video, is that seeing is often believing. The first question that people ask is not often about the economics or the return on investment about the practices featured in the videos, but rather what is the name of the person in the video, which village is he or she from. And like all of us, these agricultural communities are often biased to rewards that can be had in the present. And often that's to the detriment to rewards that might happen over the longer term. But that's also the power of video that we found, especially since not everyone has the ability to take the risk to experiment with new practices or or have the benefit of time to see whether things are going to work out over successive seasons. By showcasing other examples of farmers over a longer time horizon that they've seen results, then fellow farmers can then learn and apply what makes sense to them in their own context. And in the agricultural domain, there are like a couple key practices that have an outsized bearing on our kind of climate situation: fertilizer application, irrigation usage, uh, agroforestry, as Arti mentioned. Also, when it comes to cattle dairy farmers, feed that is being fed to animals, a couple of these practices in a couple of key commodities like rice cultivation, which is obviously super critical, as well as dairy, has an outsized bearing on our both the farmers' own productivity, which obviously they care most about rice yields and milk yields, but also has a corresponding impact on methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions, water use. And by featuring practices that farmers are able to relate with in a practical way and not like in an academic fact sheet way, but really featuring the voice of farmers that people can relate with, sharing this longer duration of impact that they can also see and not have to do for their own self, can really translate into application for these farmers on their own farms.
Yeah, thanks, Rikin. And I think you throw light on such an important lever, which is peer-to-peer influence, and the power of identifying champions within communities and really leveraging their support to mobilize more people. So thanks for sharing that. And I just want to zoom out a little bit from your individual farmer stories and move to Ashdeep. Ashdeep, wearing the different hats that you do, and you worked at various levels at different organizations in India, in the US, on the ground, and then also extending support to agtech entrepreneurs. What are the key insights you've gained about developing and deploying successful agricultural innovations for smallholder farmers?
Thank you for that question. And I'm so glad Arti and Rikin also hit on some of these things. One thing that I think was really interesting and exciting early on was this huge sort of craze around what is human-centered design? What does it mean to do design thinking? But there was a huge sort of initial gap with it about what it meant to meaningfully have feet on ground and engage with the community and invest in a community. It's kind of what has resulted in, I think, a couple of things. Me having a structure such that, yes, I teach in US for half of the year, but the other half of the year, it just makes sense to be in India. And within the next 2 years, to just make the transition to being here full time, because without that actual feet on ground and full investment in those regions and fundamentally in those people, I think the implementation of the work suffers. And if I take it to the more positive side, I think the work can be implemented more effectively and more long-term if there is actually intentional, not just sort of community-centered design, but community-led design. And it's definitely easier said than done. It is, I think, critical to think about not just at a community level. We say that a lot of like, oh, a community, but also at an individual level, what are people's aspirations? And I think Rikin brought this up really well. In some ways, there is the necessity of making sure there is money tomorrow, not 10 years in the future, not 2 years in the future, but in the near term. And having those one-on-one conversations with farmers and realizing that two farmers next to each other may have completely different aspirations is, I think, critical to a part of the process in terms of not viewing the farming community as a farming community and throwing facts, but actually at an individual level, understanding what those needs are. And seeing how they can actually lead the process and what do those actual feedback loops look like. I'll pause on specifics for now, but I think immediately, for example, two very quick case studies that come up, and folks that either I've been in conversation with or been mentored by most recently are Hazard Center, for example, where communities, where individuals, where organizations actually come to them to say, we have this problem, this is what we want to do. And People's Science Institute is another in Uttarakhand, and it's a very citizen science model. They lead the entire process. So I think that's on the front end, is how are those problems actually being sort of addressed? Who is coming up with the solution? At the end of the day, the experts are the people who are experiencing the problem, rather than me showing up with some degree from somewhere else that doesn't actually understand the ground reality. And I think on the flip side, again, both Arti and Rikin hit on this, which is that service aspect. I think behavior change is tough. I think it's risky. And what does it actually mean to build this infrastructure around that change, for there to be support and to invest in sort of helping individuals, helping farmers, helping communities change maybe their behavior, maybe their approach, maybe their practices. And to be honest, I'm going to say something kind of controversial, but I think the end goal, at least for me, oftentimes when I do this ground level work, is how to over time make myself obsolete, because I think that's success. I'll end there.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks, Ashdeep, for bringing in this perspective of integrating design thinking and really thinking about the community and the individuals and their stories and their lives, and what is it that would move them and spark them to kind of get onboarded on the journey of engaging in sustainable agriculture practices. Before we move on, I just wanted to make a quick announcement, because we have very limited time for this panel discussion, and I'm sure the audience may have questions for the panelists. So I would request if you could share your questions in the chat, and I would request the panelists, if you have the chance or the time to, if you could respond in the chat. Alternatively, please reach out to the panelists after the panel discussion. So I'm going to move to the next round, which is, I think, this question around scale, because, whenever we hear about interesting, exciting things happening in any field, I think the question always is, okay, but how is this going to scale? And of course, innovation is the spark, but scale is the fire. But we also know that the real impact of innovation does not come from just scaling up, but scaling out, which means reaching more people in more places, but in ways that truly fit their context. I think all the panelists have already shed some light on this, but I did want to, invite the panelists also to share more insight on this aspect of scale, but also making it very place-based and regionally appropriate. So Arti, to start with you, the payment for ecosystem services model that Farmers for Forests is implementing is still relatively uncommon in India. What policy changes would help scale this approach more broadly, and how are you engaging with various stakeholders, including the government, towards this?
Yes. So interestingly, it was a PES research project that was based in Uganda, which was actually one of the impetus to start Farmers for Forests. It was an RCT, a randomized control trial research project that was done by Professor Seema Jayachandran, who I think is now at Princeton. And she had studied the role of cash transfers in disincentivizing farmers to cut down forest trees on their land. And it was, I think, a 3 or 4 year long research project. And the results showed that the treatment group had a statistically significant decline in deforestation rates compared to control groups. And that's what we wanted to pilot in India. And that's what we did through Farmers for Forests. So yes, there has been some traction globally around PES, but it remains limited in many parts, including India. Though there has been some interesting work done around it in India as well. So for example, there were recent findings from a 2023 study in Punjab that highlighted the effectiveness of PES, demonstrating that offering like partial upfront payments to farmers significantly reduces stubble burning by up to, I think, like 11 percentage points, more than even like traditional PES contracts that give payments like post-compliance, right? Once objectives have been achieved. So there's definitely a significant role that this model can play. In terms of government engagement, Farmers for Forests is actively involved in that. We are, as we speak right now, establishing PMUs, which are like project management units within 3 state governments, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, and Rajasthan. These PMUs will serve as sort of like dedicated cells to drive the institutionalization of agroforestry and nature-based carbon markets. Their role will include building state-level capacity, coordinating across departments like agriculture, forest, and rural development, and enabling policies and incentives. And hopefully that will help unlock large-scale government-backed or government-enabled restoration efforts. Having said all of that, and I know there's a little bit of time, but I do want to just point out one thing, which I think is obvious, but still worth mentioning, that PES is not the solution. It's like one of several tools needed to enable climate resilient rural livelihood. So for example, in our experience too, farmers don't just respond to financial incentives. That's not what we've seen observationally or anecdotally. We are starting research studies on our model from this year, but that's what we are seeing. It's not just the financial incentives. They stay engaged because we also offer a one-stop solution, right? Access to high quality saplings, drip irrigation, training, and consistent hand-holding in the early years when trees are most vulnerable. It is quite an undertaking to transition your land to agroforestry. The upfront financial cost is not a joke, especially for farmers. But PES, yes, does act as that initial bridge. It builds trust and reduces short-term risk. But the real shift often comes from like equipping farmers with the tools and the knowledge and the confidence to make restoration and regenerative practices part of their long-term livelihood strategy.
Thanks, Arti. And I think noted that you need a combination of, it can't just be extrinsic motivation. I think it's important to create the conditions for also, nurturing that intrinsic motivation. Ashdeep, quickly over to you. Your involvement in agricultural innovations, climate action, and social sector communities spans both India and the US. What are some of the key challenges and opportunities you've experienced in scaling agricultural technologies in both these contexts?
As I'm sort of thinking about answers to all of these questions, I'm realizing that they may be controversial, they may be different. So it's fun to bring in a different perspective and sort of speak openly about some of this. I say controversial because I think that there's been a benefit in. It was interesting. Arti and I were actually talking about this very recently. There's a benefit in operating in 2 levels. What does it mean to think about entrepreneur support? What does it mean to think about policy change? What does it mean to think about fundamental systemic change that's necessary? And what is the gap between that and what is happening fundamentally on ground? And it's huge. Like there are a lot of, policies in place that look great on paper in both contexts, but then the way in which they actually act on ground, and also in some ways the way in which also entrepreneurship is needed to be able to fill some of those gaps it's critical. So I definitely, that's been one of the benefits of, I think, operating in across various like verticals and horizontal axes, entrepreneur support, but also field work, education, but also sort of volunteering. And I think some of the major things that come to mind in terms of like sort of both contexts is, you brought up scale at the beginning. I think too often when I've thought about this work and when I've thought specifically about funder priorities, it has to do with broad scale, the amount of people, rather than deep scale, how much impact per person. And I think that becomes a huge issue. I'll stop there. There's many thoughts there, but I don't think it's about checking a box that, okay, we reached yet another person. But again, looping back to what does long-term commitment and engagement look like? And there also needs to be a mindset shift in terms of that is a priority. It's not example about how many wells were installed. It's about are those wells actually, or pumps were installed, are those pumps actually functional at the end of the day? I think second is it links back to our priorities. There are, I mean, we are sort of in a range of systems that are exploitative from a human side, are extractive in terms of the environment. And what is, I think in both contexts, but not just in India and US, but at a global level, what is sort of the behavior shift and mindset shift that's required? Because it's very easy that doing what we're doing right now is the easier route. And there are difficulties involved in terms of power, policy, and overall shifting these systemic priorities. Who decides, who benefits, who is actually affected, who's involved in the decision-making process. And then I think from a more practical sense, there's always a funding issue and access to finance in both places for all kinds of organizations. We live in a world where you need money to make things happen. And climate adaptation and resilience, for many years, there's been conversation about it being a gap. Specifically in the global south, there's like a 90% funding gap in terms of what needs to be done and the funding that's available for it. So I think that's sort of a major thing. And then I think there's an aspect of both in the US and India need to be adaptive, to be agile, because when we talk about sort of meaningful scale and we talk about commitment, I think about this a lot. I think India is truly a continent within a country. You sort of move even 10, 50 kilometers and things are very different. Soils are different, climates are different, priorities are different, crops are different. And it goes back to the fact that we don't consider humans are also different. So there's no one size that fits all. So what does it mean to sort of still create that impact, but be agile and adaptive in all of it? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ashdeep. And I think one of the points that you touched upon, we won't have time to discuss that further, but I think is around the need for funders to also be patient in their approach when it comes to investing in sustainable agriculture, because I think to see impact, you need to invest for the long run. So thanks for also bringing that out. Rikin, I had a few more questions for you, but because we are short on time, I'm going to ask you the most important one, because Digital Green has also expanded beyond videos to develop data platforms and AI tools for farmers. So how are you balancing these high-tech solutions with the realities of rural connectivity and the on-ground challenges around digital literacy?
Yeah, so the conventional way in which agricultural extension or the adult education of farmers has historically been practiced in India and around the world has been a training and visit or farmer field school type of approach where demonstration plots take place, experts come out, farmers visit, and some portion of them go back to their own fields and apply the practices that they learn about on their own farms. That costs about 35 US dollars to get one farmer to adopt one new practice. The videos we found which were produced by and for farmers was able to reduce that cost down to 3.5 US to get one farmer to apply one of the new practices that they would see featured. About 2.5 years ago, kind of in the tail end of COVID, as some of these physical distancing requirements didn't allow these farmers to kind of come together and watch these videos in person, we saw a huge sort of silver lining of the reverse migration that took place during COVID for urban kind of folks to go back to, in some cases, to the villages, often with their mobile phones and obviously the geo effect, wherein farmers were watching these videos on YouTube. Got like 85 million views to our YouTube channel with about 10,000 of these locally produced videos. And so that, together with the advances in generative AI, allowed us to kind of create this application that we call Farmer Chat so that farmers could use local language, voice, text, images, and get not like a robot's response from like a generic ChatGPT or Wikipedia type of source, but rather from the videos that are proximate and season specific to themselves and be able to relate with it. And so that's been reducing the cost by another order of magnitude down to like 35 cents per farmer per adoption of new practice. And then also, what it's also doing is flipping the paradigm, wherein agricultural extension has been historically a very top-down supply side driven thing, kind of to Ashdeep's kind of point. Like it goes from research to the extension agents to the farmers. But now with these Gen AI types of tools, now you can actually hear the voice of the farmers about what their actual needs and interests are, which are extremely diverse across time and space and demography and all the rest. And that means that the AI system is not going to be perfect. It's not going to always answer their question properly, but it can inform policymakers, researchers, practitioner people to see what the actual needs are in a very disaggregate way to be able to close the gaps that still remain for these farmers.
Yes, thanks, Rikin, and also for shedding light on how AI can be used constructively in this context. So just to wrap up, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I hope we can continue this conversation offline as well. And those who found this interesting, please feel free to connect with the panelists. But just to close this discussion, I'd really like each of you to, as your call to action, what would be your one piece of advice, or what would you like the audience to kind of take away, particularly in ways in which that they can step in to support this transition, whether as consumers, as entrepreneurs, as funders, as policy advocates. So maybe Ashdeep, we can start with you.
Absolutely. And I'll start off with something that Amita, so close to my heart, posted in the comment section as I was looking at it. I think that I'm going to try to summarize my thoughts. I've been talking a lot in this session. I think the future of agriculture sort of within India and globally, honestly, it demands a revolution. I think it's one where we're sort of actually shifting our mindset around restoring the land for future generations. We're actually honoring the people and the hands that are putting food in our mouths fundamentally. And we're actually sort of shifting away from prioritizing short-term gain, even as people at the end of the day that are, on this call have a certain level of privilege, and we're refusing to sort of sacrifice human lives and human health, or even the health of the planet, for short-term gain. Something that Amita said, there's a lot of conversation about combining modern technology and traditional knowledge, and I think that there's huge potential there. But I think it requires respecting people that have that practical knowledge and experience, and actually democratizing access to innovation in many ways. So on so many levels, I think, in summary, I think it's about really choosing change and choosing like courage over comfort and over convenience. So as consumers, sort of shifting our ways that we demand food, like food that regenerates and doesn't actually exploit people and the land. As entrepreneurs, I look at both of you as incredible examples, both Arti and Rikin, sort of thinking about ways in which models and approaches can be built that actually prioritize justice and prioritize resilience for farmers at a ground level. And I think fundamentally as citizens, it's actually speaking up, using our voices, pushing for policies that cause that systemic change. And at an agricultural level, are thinking about resilience and equity, and not just yield, but actual health. I think it's really urgent. And I think it sort of needs solidarity and a focus on actual like human and planetary dignity.
Thanks, Arti.
Yeah, no, I completely echo what Ash was saying. I think it's true. I think we need to change how we as citizens, consumers, value these natural resources, value forests, regenerative agriculture, because the truth is farmers often mirror what the market rewards, right? So if we want more biodiversity, less chemical use, and more forest positive practices, we need demand that recognizes and pays for those outcomes. That means rethinking how we consume, supporting agroecological produce, asking tougher questions about supply chains. Now, that's what we can do at a more individual and local level that hopefully over time will have an impact. Now, the problem is climate change is like the existential challenge of our times, and the scale is mammoth. So I don't even know if we can afford to wait for that kind of slow incremental change. So what I would truly actually want is climate becoming a very, very integral, important lens through which people vote in politicians and governments. And that we have credible options in terms of policymakers and governments who truly do care about the toxic air that we are all breathing and the fast disappearing green spaces and loss of biodiversity and depleted groundwater. So I think if we want that kind of change at that kind of scale, that would be my ideal call to action.
Thanks, Arti. Rikin.
I'd say that I think that there's a real need for us to put back small scale producers at the center of our food and agriculture system. It might seem obvious like that, like agriculture should depend on farmers, but for very long, and I'd say technology often has been to the detriment. Everything from mechanization to now our future of AI has a force that kind of disenfranchises these marginal populations and kind of centralizes a lot of wealth and power. And so there's a real need for the technologists and policymakers and practitioners to really see how we can immerse ourselves in these communities in such a way that we understand their needs, their interests, their aspirations, and can create these tools in a way that's really going to increase their agency and choice of how they want to be able to uplift themselves. And I think that just requires us to spend the time to actually understand like these sources of food that we all consume, but we are so often disconnected from. That's
Yeah, thanks, Rikin, and thanks all of you. I think lots of food for thought there, and very powerful calls to action. This has been so insightful and so energizing. And I think today we've paused and reflected on the need for responsible innovations. I think I wanted to really highlight responsibility because, as you all mentioned, we have to be very mindful of the vulnerabilities that smallholder farmers experience and make sure that that any intervention in sustainable agriculture really puts them at the center and is kind of people first. But of course, when it comes to feeding a growing population or just protecting the health of our planet, that's the bigger picture. But it starts with farmers, and then of course connecting to how it helps even at a planetary level when we scale up these efforts, help build climate resilience and adapt to the impacts of climate change, and also mitigate and sequester more carbon and so on. So thank you to all the panelists, our audience, and to all those pushing the boundaries of what's possible in climate resilient agriculture. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manvi, for leading a great discussion, and thank you to our panelists.